Good morning and a warm welcome to day 2 of the 2024 Nuremberg Forum. We will now have the first of 5 panel discussions, which will be moderated by Ms. Darleen Seda, who is Senior Officer for Training and Capacity Strengthening at the Nuremberg Academy. In this capacity, Darleen leads the capacity strengthening work of the Nuremberg Academy, which is conducted both here in Nuremberg as well as worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kiran, and good morning to each and every one of you. Welcome to the first panel of this year's Nuremberg Forum. Yesterday, we had very moving testimonies from individual survivors and how they have dedicated their lives to advancing children's rights in armed conflict. This panel is going to explore how international law continues to advance, or not, the protection of children in armed conflict. Children do not start wars, and they cannot end them, but they always pay the highest price. These are the striking words of UNICEF Chief Catherine Russell. Despite the almost universal acceptance of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, children in conflict continue to experience unimaginable atrocities: killing and maiming, sexual violence, recruitment and use in wars, abduction, attack against schools and hospitals, and denial to humanitarian access. These violations, also known as the 6 grave violations, were identified by the United Nations Secretary General based on their horrific nature and the severity of prolonged impact on the lives of children. They form the basis of the Security Council's framework to monitor, report, and respond to abuses suffered by children in times of war. The 1966 Grasser-Machel report, called The Impact of Armed Conflict on Children, concluded that whatever the causes of modern-day brutality towards children, that time has come to call a halt, and demanded that children simply have no part in war. The international community must proclaim this attack on children for what it is: intolerable and unacceptable. End of quote. The report was so profound and groundbreaking that it led to the expansion of the international legal framework, including and particularly the adoption of the optional protocol to the Convention of the Rights of the Child on the involvement of children in armed conflict in 2000. Despite existing legal instruments, mandates, and accountability mechanisms, evolving conflict dynamics continue to demonstrate the vulnerability of children in war. Catastrophic conflicts for children, including in Ukraine, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Myanmar, Haiti, Sudan, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Somalia, and most recently, Lebanon, remains deeply concerning. Why is there persistent lack of accountability for crimes against children? Why is the convention the most ratified instrument in human rights law, but the most violated? Are the legal protections provided to children in armed conflict sufficient? And if not, why is this the case? And what can be done to improve the situation? How can international human rights law advance the protection of children in armed conflict? I am privileged and deeply honored to moderate this all-women panel. Very powerful women who have the burden of answering really difficult but pertinent questions. So before we start, I would like to introduce our panelists and ask them for their 1 to 2 opening statements. I will start with Professor Siobhán Mullaly. Professor Mullally is the director at the Irish Centre for Human Rights and the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. Professor Mullally, your opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to join this event and to speak this morning on this panel. I will be commenting mainly on my role as UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. The mandate, in fact, was established 20 years ago by the Human Rights Council, so it's now in its 20th year. It has this particular focus on children, especially women and children, as part of the title. But in fact, as with many other areas of international law, the attention to children has often been limited or somewhat an add-on to other areas of work. Globally, 1 in 3 victims of trafficking are children. That's from the UNODC Global Report, the most reliable data that we have, although this, of course, is an area in which data is often contested and numbers may be unknown. It's recognised that in situations of armed conflict, the risks of trafficking in persons increase, particularly for children. This has been noted in a number of Security Council resolutions, in reports of the Secretary-General, and in other reports looking specifically at the risks faced by children in armed conflict. Trafficking can take place at the hands of different actors, armed groups, armed forces, and others. The purposes of exploitation are diverse. Most attention is given to recruitment and use, in hostilities, which may be in combat roles or support roles, but trafficking can also occur for purposes of sexual exploitation linked to sexual slavery, may also be for purposes of child marriage or domestic servitude, and is often a combination of these, occurring at different points in time. Trafficking of children is also gendered in that boys are often targeted for recruitment and use in hostilities, in combat roles, whereas girls may be more likely to be targeted for sexual exploitation, child marriage and domestic servitude, but also for recruitment and use in armed conflict situations. What we see is that children are often not identified as victims as such, and often are punished rather than assisted and protected, so punished for their association with armed groups, and may not be given the assistance and protection to which they are entitled as children under international law. We have seen on some occasions the status of a child victim of trafficking being raised at defence level, for example, as in the Ongwen case at appeal level, but limited attention is given to how the non-punishment principle in law on human trafficking may apply in this context of armed conflict. In my work as UN Special Rapporteur and engaging with different actors, we see a very siloed approach to issues of child trafficking. It is seen primarily as a criminal justice issue, as an issue that can only happen when borders are crossed. As a matter of international law, that is incorrect. But we know that on the ground, actors engaged in humanitarian or conflict settings are not always familiar with the trends or patterns of child trafficking, do not have the resources and capacity to undertake prevention action, assistance, protection, or referral. And those who are working on trafficking are often contained within a criminal justice focus and do not always link over to humanitarian settings or conflict settings. So those difficulties arise on the ground as well. There's also a fragmentation, of course, of legal regimes, and as we heard yesterday, differences also in relation to the age question. The Palermo Protocol includes only very brief reference to children, but a child is defined as any person under the age of 18. Trafficking falls within the peremptory norm prohibiting slavery, servitude and forced or compulsory labour, as found by the European Court of Human Rights and Rancif in Cyprus and Russia. But that crossover into how it links in to those peremptory norms is often not well understood. There's also less engagement with issues of trafficking within international humanitarian law and international criminal law, though some references to how trafficking may reach the level of crimes against humanity of enslavement or sexual slavery as a war crime. The Libya fact-finding mission would be one in particular that has addressed this. But we see quite frequently that investigative mechanisms, fact-finding missions, are not given a specific mandate with regard to trafficking, and where it is not spelled out as such, we see these gaps in identification and prevention, assistance and protection, and of course accountability. And so in my work recently with the Office of the SRSG on Children in Armed Conflict, we have tried to look at how child trafficking links in with the 6 grave violations against children in armed conflict, and the purpose of that being to try to strengthen prevention, but also to assist in recognising trends around child trafficking that occur in armed conflict settings and documenting that through monitoring and reporting. So I hope we can talk further on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mullally, for that extensive opening, and I think we are going to also delve much deeper into the specifics, especially on linking child trafficking in armed conflict. Then I will introduce my next panelist, and that is Professor Anne Skelton, who does not need introduction because she was already sitting here yesterday afternoon. But just to repeat, she is the chairperson of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child and the chair for Children's Rights in a Sustainable World at Leiden University. Professor Skelton, for your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Darleen, and thanks again to the organisers for this wonderful opportunity to be here with you. I've worked in children's rights for my whole life. I started working in South Africa during the apartheid era, so I know what children's rights denials look like in a repressive environment. And yet I've never felt as overwhelmed by children's rights crisis as I have in the last 2 years. Being the chair of a treaty body at such a time is both a huge responsibility and an enormously frustrating experience because of the limitations of the mandate. And very often people don't know about the limitations of the mandate, so they expect that the committee would be doing more, that the committee should have been holding many people accountable by now. A little later this morning, when we get into the detail, I'll talk about how the committee's been trying to stand on the shoulders of other mechanisms to be able to try to extend our reach a little. But I also want to say I still remain slightly optimistic that international human rights law can provide some solutions, or at least that we should continue to try. Last week, Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese wrote, "We'll miss international law when it's gone." So we'd better use it to the best that we can while we can. So what can the committee do? Well, the committee, as I explained yesterday, reviews states' parties, but in a sense we're very passive in that way because we have to wait until states come to us. However, Israel had reported to the committee prior to the events of the 7th of October, and therefore the report was outdated by the time we were going to review them because there's a delay, of course, in the system, which means that, things are often outdated. But in this case, they were so outdated that it was really unusable. So we issued a new list of issues asking Israel to report on what had happened in the interim period. And even this in itself can be an action because that is a public document and people on the ground can see it and can see what questions have been answered. And when the replies come and they are inadequate, that is also visible to everyone. So, as I've explained, we have a dialogue with the states party, and that takes 6 hours. So 6 hours in the room with a high-level delegation of a states party is an opportunity to really drill down. And it is, to an extent, somewhat performative. And we were talking yesterday on this panel yesterday about the importance of not remaining silent, the importance of narrative. To some extent, this does add to a narrative, and it puts the narrative in a public space, which one hopes that people working close to the ground can also use. And then, of course, the concluding observations can be used as well. One other thing that I'd just briefly like to touch on is that we do also have a communications procedure under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which allows individual complaints to be brought, as well as inquiries to be requested, and those don't require exhaustion of domestic remedies. And there is even a mechanism for a state-to-state complaint, but it hasn't been used under the Convention on the Rights of the Child yet. Part of the reason for that is that only 52 states have ratified this optional protocol. So therefore, for example, Ukraine has ratified it, but Russia hasn't, so one wouldn't be able to use the interstate communication process. But one very interesting case that we did have deals with a group of children that perhaps isn't often on our agenda, but children affected by armed conflict, and that is children who are in the camps in northeast Syria together with their mothers. And the committee here was asked to determine a very difficult jurisdictional question because France, the case was brought against France by the grandparents of the children. And the French courts had said, this is not within the jurisdiction of France. We cannot make any distinction, any determination on this. And so the grandparents came to the committee, and the committee, in fact, did find, and this was an extension of international law, criticized by some as perhaps going a little too far, and that is that we found that because France could act to bring those children, to repatriate those children back to France, knew what the situation was, and in the dire circumstances in which children were dying every day in those camps, because they had the capability to act, that went along with a responsibility to act, and in that regard came within the jurisdiction of the committee. So I think this is another area that we are finding increasingly complex, and that is jurisdictional arguments and how we need to grow the law to be able to be more expansive in our work.
Thank you very much, Professor Skelton, as well. I would like to move on to introduce our third panelist, Ambassador Athaliah Molokomme. She is the permanent representative of Botswana to the United Nations and a member of the Advisory Council of the Nuremberg Academy. Ambassador Molokomme, for your opening statement.
It's okay, I'll take that professor title as well. It's quite nice. I see I sit between professors, so it might just rub off. So thank you so much, Darleen and Christoph, Director of the Academy, for organizing this forum in this 10th year of its existence and keeping the legacy of the Nuremberg principles alive, because I think, as was said in the opening statements yesterday, this is of critical importance, especially at this time, you know, with the geopolitical situation in the world, which I need not repeat. I think everyone has pointed to the challenges that we are facing now. So it is my pleasure and privilege to be part of the journey, the whole journey with the Academy, this 10th edition, as I said, of the forum, as a member of the Advisory Committee, and to contribute in place of Professor Chief Justice Osman. Apologize to any of my Geneva colleagues who may be participating online, because in Geneva I would not be allowed to participate in an all-female panel because the gender parity pledge, but my excuse is exactly that the person I'm speaking instead of was a male, and it would not have been an all-female panel had it not been for my participation. So I will take the blame, not the Academy. This year's chosen theme, which is protecting children's rights in armed conflict, is, I believe, as speakers have said before me, both timely and of critical importance for all of the reasons they mentioned yesterday. I will not repeat those reasons. Of course, children in their own right are entitled to human rights and to protection as vulnerable members of our societies due to their age and dependence on adults. I need not add that protecting children is also a worthwhile investment in the future of families, of communities, countries, and indeed the entire world. I happen to be the only person up here who represents a government, and I think that governments, states, members of the United Nations bear a special responsibility, a particular responsibility to protect children in all cases, but in particular in cases of armed conflict. My career has straddled both the local, domestic, academic, research, civil society, regional, and global arenas. And I think, like Anne-Marie Skelton, I kind of feel like I've been in this game for a long time at all these levels. We've all worked very hard, and there are many in this room who've done a lot in this regard. But there's still so much more to be done, and so many threats and challenges that are existing that it's easy to become discouraged. But I am not discouraged, like those who've spoken before me, otherwise we would not be here. I think we need to keep working at this, because as they say, when the going gets tough, the tough get going, and I think we are all very tough here. I recognize what you say, Professor Skelton, about the limitations of treaty bodies, because one of the institutions that, as ambassadors in Geneva, we are accredited to is the Human Rights Council. And it is challenged. It is an institution that is having to deal with huge polarization, a heavy agenda of issues that continue to become more and more difficult. You know, we've just had elections to the Human Rights Council. We have new members, and we have members whose mandates have been extended. I come from Botswana, which is currently not a member of the Human Rights Council. We are observers. We served for 2 terms, once as deputy chair. And I can tell you that it does not get easier there, but we continue to be an active observer in the proceedings of the Council. We see many states come in, and I recognize what you've just said, Anne-Marie, of the difficulties that these mandate holders like yourself and treaty bodies face when states behave in the way they do. And again, I think we can be much better. So I think that just by way of opening, I will share some perspectives or reflections on the continent of Africa, and how I think on the continent some efforts have been done at the regional and sub-regional level to ensure that we play our part as an African continent in protecting children in situations of armed conflict. So I'll stop there and wait for the next question. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Molokomme. Last but not least, it's a pleasure for me to also introduce Oleksandra Romantsova, a human rights defender and executive director of Center for Civil Liberties. As you may know, the center has won as a co-recipient the Nobel Peace Prize in 2022. Oleksandra, your opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really, good feeling to be here. I need to confess I'm sitting here and visualized how exactly will be organized tribunal against the aggression against the Putin. So it's one of the ways how you can use exactly good historical examples. Center for Civil Liberties started documented war crimes from 2014, and we understood that we don't know nothing. That's why our colleagues from Croatia help us to figure out how to make a field mission. Our Russian human rights defenders who documented war crimes in Chechnya bring us methodology. Ecuador human rights organization, which exactly before we even never met, but appealed to us to help to understand how to create new law about enforced disappearances. And that's how it works. People who care about children, it's people from whole the world. And maybe NGOs have a such, privilege. We are not limited by any mandate or just one topic. We exactly can exchange by experience. One of the best, our friends from creator of Museum War Childhood come to Ukraine, and now we have such project there. So it's exactly how it can work for children. Why? Ukrainian children now figure out that any form of war everywhere in the world, it's against them. Any war, it's first of all against children's and childhood, because children's, it's a human at this special shape, childhood. And at Ukraine now, we have situation when children not just kidnapped or trafficked, because it's a huge problem in the world, but we see system. That system was planned before, because Russian Federation accept the special law, which now they use it for indoctrination of children, 4 years before full-scale invasion. And they started exactly kidnap and indoctrinate Ukrainian children from 2014, when the first Russian soldiers come to the Ukrainian land at Crimea and Donbass. And that's what we have as the result, that children who rising up at Crimea from 2014 now they are part of Russian army and fight with their native, like children from other side, from Ukrainians at Donbass now, at Kherson, at Zaporizhia. So biggest our care about children, that children, it's a future adult people who will make a decision, who will fight or not, who can change the society for the best, start to be a doctor, architect, or judges, policemen, I don't know, professors. But now, huge one of our example, it's Russia Federation system indoctrinate them at the such situation when they don't know their roots, they hate the people which exactly were their neighbors just a few years before. And we have millions of people who wounded by this war. It's not only children's, but when they separated from their family because they need to escape and live somewhere here, Germans accept huge numbers of our children, or need to stay at Ukraine and be shelled, missiled every day, or going from the school because of shelling, the bomb shelter. All of this, it creates future adults. And when we speak about illegally deported people, some of them escaped from Russia by their foot, mostly the teenagers. They going through border by wood fields, sometimes even use a front line, like a more geographically shorter distance. And that's we will have in the future like a trauma. So one of human rights defenders now, we have documented war crimes, but existing Jews who exactly take experience from this conflict which our beloved moderator mentioned from, for example, Somali or from Mali with rehabilitation of children after this. Because, you know, one of the examples in one of the books, it's a hoodie who helped child to survive after shooting at head. And that's he bring to his life. It's 15 years old Yuri. And it's happened not only with Ukrainian children. That's why for us, Ukrainian human rights defenders, it's really important to mention that we need to stop what now happened with Ukrainian children. But we need to have international answer, mechanism, mandates, decisions to help children in the hour nowadays be really, you know, not only survive, but be qualified, be happy adults in the future. So I will stop here. And I'm really glad to be with this really amazing woman in this platform. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oleksandra. The honor is all ours. So maybe perhaps we can start with the specific questions. And if I could start with you, Professor Mullally. You have led a number of UN missions from South Sudan to Central African Republic, Bangladesh, Colombia, Tajikistan. Based on your mandate, what observations and specific challenges have you observed in general, but also specifically when it comes to the linkage between child trafficking in armed conflict?
Thank you very much. So the country visits that we undertake as special rapporteurs, part of the mandate from the Human Rights Council, it is dependent on acceptance. It's with the consent of the state concerned. These country visits that I've undertaken, we see the linkages, for example, in Bangladesh, among Rohingya refugees in Cox's Bazar in particular, where many may have been trafficked en route before leaving Myanmar and arriving in Bangladesh, but then as refugees in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar, with the limitations in terms of the conditions there, their status, lack of access to the domestic curriculum, may be targeted again by armed groups also operating within the refugee setting, and may become victims of trafficking or may be recruited onwards for purposes of sexual exploitation and child marriage. In South Sudan, armed groups, we observed the practices of abductions, for example, for purposes of child marriage, domestic servitude, recruitment and use, and the prevalence of that at different points in time and in different places, and the lack of accountability, but also the lack of identification, assistance and referral pathways for children, even where there may have been, albeit very weak or limited, mechanisms in place, say in an urban centre, to focus on trafficking of children in street situations or exploitation and begging. It wasn't looking outwards as to what was happening in a displacement setting or the conflict setting or the work of armed groups. Central African Republic, different actors involved, concerns also about the presence of mercenaries and potential there as well for engagement in child trafficking for different forms. Anne mentioned northeast Syria, and I've been involved with other special procedures in communications in relation to children recruited to Syria for purposes of sexual exploitation, child marriage, sexual slavery. The Shamima Begum case, for example, in the UK, the Special Immigration Appeals Commission recognised credible evidence that she was a victim of trafficking, recruited as a child, age 15, and that situation remains unresolved and may come to Strasbourg, to the European Court of Human Rights, but as Anne mentioned, there are challenging jurisdictional questions, and the Committee on the Rights of the Child has taken a strong position, and I think those questions will come up again. Sudan, of course, is a situation where we see massive displacement and risks faced by children. I've been involved in communications there and joining with other special rapporteurs highlighting the situation of thousands and thousands of children, of course, killed in Gaza. But as we heard before the International Court of Justice, the phenomenon of so many wounded children with no surviving family, separated, displaced, and as the situation becomes protracted, what are the risks that may arise and will continue to do so? We intervened, for example, also in Ukraine, joining with others to make statements on looking at children in institutional settings, children with disabilities who may be at particular risk. In Colombia, for example, the race and ethnicity element, children of indigenous communities, of Afro-descendant communities, were particularly at risk of trafficking for a range of purposes of exploitation by armed groups, and continuing in the transition phase even after the peace agreement was adopted. And that has been really taken on board, looking at those intersections. But again, it's something that more work needs to be done on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mullally. I would like to come back to some points that you've raised, but I would like to also ask Professor Skelton. You have mentioned in your opening statement the frustration and difficulty you currently experience as chair of the committee. You have sat in the committee since 2017, if I'm not mistaken, and currently the chair. What would you say are, before becoming member of the committee, what has changed in terms of trends in armed conflict? You've said the last 2 years particularly have been very, very difficult. Do you see any changes before and right now, and specifically in the last 2 years, what exactly is going on the ground?
I would say it's been seismic. The move, children and armed conflict issue has simply moved to the front of the children's rights agenda in the last few years. And I say this because I can see that in the early years of my time on the committee, yes, we always asked questions, obviously, about armed conflict, particularly about our optional protocol, which only really focuses on recruitment. But Article 38 of the Convention, which is really very, very important, is the article that covers all children's rights, the impact on children. And I myself, having though I'm a child rights expert, so-called, had not delved as deeply into Article 38 before, until I have in the last, until now. And that requires one to also understand international humanitarian law because of the fact that both are integrated into Article 38. So suddenly, one starts to look at things differently. So if we think about, the 6 grave violations of children's rights, which were identified by the Security Council and which the Secretary General reports on to the Security Council every year, They've been there, and they were certainly on the agenda, but I can say they've kind of gone off the charts. He has reported increases against all of them. So killing and maiming, the numbers have just shot up. Recruitment and use on the up. Abduction. So abduction wasn't something that was so much on the agenda, but obviously since the war against Ukraine, we have seen that. And here's a big connection with the Genocide Convention, because the forcible removal of children across borders like that is a ground for finding genocide. So suddenly, the international humanitarian law has to also be factored in when considering what are the solutions, what are the questions that a committee like ours is asking, and what can we demand from states as well. We're not in a position to make a finding of genocide, obviously, but we can certainly ask questions that would, elicit responses, and we can raise our concerns about these matters. Sexual violence on the increase, and this was on our agenda yesterday, and I think Siobhán is flagging some of the issues around that very strongly. Attacks on schools and hospitals. Well, I mean, do I need to say anything? We just see it every day on the news, and that this is not even, this is just international humanitarian law without bringing children into it. These are civilian targets, so except in very narrow circumstances, they cannot be targets. And as I keep on saying to everyone, children are always civilians. They are always civilians. So there's a constant awareness of the disproportionality in this regard. And then I think denial of humanitarian access is another thing that again links to the Genocide Convention. And again is, because we have to look at it as part of conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of a group. Of course, the intention is always going to have to be proved at some point, but certainly, as we've seen from the International Court of Justice's findings in the application by South Africa, there's sufficient evidence to have interim measures at least. And so we see all of this. I also see some completely very new issues. For example, we know that in Gaza we have a new acronym, WCNLF, which is Wounded Child with No Surviving Family. And another thing that's actually coming up strongly in the committee's reviews is militarization of schools. So we see this hugely in Russia and Ukraine, and also in Israel. So when we reviewed Russia, they told us that proudly that in their schools they have something called lessons about important things. This is what they call them. And we'd heard from civil society that what they're teaching in these lessons about important things is what weapons are used in the war heroes, special desks named after war heroes in classrooms and so on. And so I recommended to them that instead of doing that, perhaps they could have lessons about important things that had to do with the Convention on the Rights of the Child and peace education and safety in schools. This would be more compliant with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And then recently in Israel as well, actually the last time Israel came to the committee said peace education should be high on your agenda. What's happened since? There's been a new law passed that now makes it an aim of education, a viable aim of education amongst others, to educate people for service in the armed forces, children in Israel. So it's definitely going in the wrong direction, and these are kind of really concerning new trends that we're seeing. I don't know if they're new exactly, they're probably not new, but they're coming more to the fore. We're seeing them, and we need to respond to them.
Thank you very much, Professor Skelton. I think also looking at other conflicts in different areas, you also see exactly these things that you're mentioning, abduction, coming to the forefront, especially in the Russian invasion of Ukraine war. But perhaps I could then move to Ambassador Molokomme to speak on the African context, which has been seen as very prone to conflicts, new conflicts that are emerging year in, year out, existing conflicts that become even more complex and fragmented. Why do you think this is the case, considering the heavy impact on children? Why do you think this is the case, and what do you think is the role that the African Union specifically is playing in this regard?
Thanks, Darleen. I'm happy you posed the question of the causes, because these are important, much as we need to look forward and not keep looking back. But it is important to look at history and why, in order to be able to decide or determine or come up with solutions to move forward. This is not because, as is often the stereotype of Africa as the dark continent with many wars, there are many conflicts all over the world. As you correctly point out, they are not only new and emerging conflicts, there are some that they're old and they're persistent, but of course tend to be ignored by the world and the media for many different reasons, to pay more attention to those raging in other parts of the world. The reasons and causes, as I say, are well known, and they are varied. Of course, they include the fact that Africa was colonized. We're not the only continent that was colonized, but we are colonized in a particularly exploitative way that is prone to a continuation of this exploitation when it comes to the resources of the continent, of which we have plenty. So our resources continue to be exploited for the benefit of other nations, in some cases in collusion with our governments and our groups that operate in our countries. So even after independence and liberation, you continue to see unequal power relations in the political and economic sphere, persistent trade imbalances between Africa and the rest of the world, and as I said, competition for our rich resources as a continent by local groups and outside powers, often in collaboration with each other. It's a major cause of armed conflicts and undermines development and has most negative impact on children, women and children, whether they are directly involved as child soldiers or their parents and other relatives are unable to take care of them, of their welfare, including nutrition, education, and health. So, it's a long list. We have weak governance and fragile institutions, which are often too weak and dysfunctional to enforce laws protecting children. In many of our countries, as you know, our legal systems, struggle to have sufficient staff, to have the reach out in countries that are big and sparsely populated, where armed groups operate. So the lack of functional systems during and after conflict, of course, then hinders the delivery of services, education in particular, healthcare and child protection services that are in so much need. We, of course, also have regional instability. Many conflicts on the continent are transnational. They spread across borders, and they affect multiple countries. I need not give examples. So it becomes difficult to coordinate a response that is that prioritizes the interests of the child across multiple jurisdictions. I mentioned economic instability, poverty, gender-based violence, make no mention. Women and girls find themselves in conflict zones disproportionately affected by sexual violence, including rape, forced marriages. The list is endless. And of course, the stigma attached to this violence, which we know at the domestic level, militates against successfully dealing with these, may prevent them from, access to education and healthcare. So the impacts are amazing. Look, so I don't know whether you want me to talk about what we are doing on the continent now or wait for the next question, because we are doing a lot.
Yes. Perhaps then I could ask you a follow-up question on the specific role that the AU plays and what the AU has so far done, because I'm aware of 2 policies that the AU recently in 2022 adopted. Maybe we can hold on that and then you can speak about it in a few minutes. Sure. Thank you. I would like to now turn to Oleksandra. You have been heavily involved in documenting violations against children in the Ukrainian context. We have also heard from testimonies yesterday from the ICC prosecutor saying, there is a need to factor in the voices of children. We also heard of various misconceptions that armed conflict does not affect children in the same way. It affects a 3-year-old in a different way, a 17-year-old in a different way. I'm just curious, what are some of the common misconceptions that you have come across while doing the monitoring and documentation of evidence in the Ukrainian context?
Thank you. Yes, when we documented war crimes, we exactly see that it's system around the children which was damaged by wars. Because you mentioned about schools, and I know, for example, when I visit South Africa, that at the continent it's a huge movement to engage children at education, and each school really important to build it, to have a place for children to have education. But at Ukraine, just last 3 years, they destroyed 2,654 schools. And when we speak about, when we speak with children, they want to come home, they want to come back to their schools because it's part of their security, it's part of their mental health to feel them safety in their school. But it's impossible, and that's one of the biggest group of buildings which was systematically shelling. Or use it when it's occupied territory, they use it like a place of location for some armed forces there. And sometimes, like in really like horrible situation like Bucha, I think you heard about this small city near the Kiev, that one of the example, because school basement usually used for bomb shelter, at the moment when Russia forces come to this city and use one of the school like artilleristic point, that was 62 persons at basement at that moment, 6 pregnant women. And they didn't give them opportunity exactly relocate from this bomb shelter to other basement or something like this. Why so? Because they know that Ukraine army will not answer to this artilleristic point because they know about these people at the basement. It's only one of the example. Every time when you speak about children, you need to start from pregnancy till the moment when these children can be recruited to Russian army. And that's why so big flow with the children going from Ukraine to other countries. And just one more example, one more book about children rehabilitation. Mom, next time there is a war, let's take our summer thing with us too. That's 7 years old Nastya. So it's changed the lives, and now we have concrete crimes against the children physically, destroyed the system which exactly made the children's lives full, that school, that medicine facilities, that opportunity exactly be with your families, and really important that I was online with you yesterday because of my situation with airport, but that moment when General Prosecutor, International General Prosecutor mentioned that children's voices need to be in this process. We need to understand it's not just to speak with children. It's quite traumatized for them, remembered what's happened, and have some interpretation. So that means we need to have a system to care about them during this moment when we involve them at the investigation. But we surely need investigation. Yura, which I mentioned before, when I asked him what kind of justice you want for soldiers who shoot at you and kill before that, few moments before your dad, by like bullet at the heart. That's how he can. I wanna them. All of them, like be killed, but That's not what you expected, like heard from 15 years old guy, you know. So it's really important to give them alternative. It needs to be justice. They need to feel that exactly exists something like not only one more flow of hate, one more flow of killing. That's why we're so responsible now to bring this system of justice and show it to children, explain how it's works, and explain how their voices can be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to still stick to this theme of incorporating children's voices. The CRC under Article 12, I think, provides for the right of the child to be heard. If you allow me, I could just read the phrasing itself. It provides that children should be free to have opinions in all matters affecting them, and those views should be given due weight in accordance with the age and maturity of the child. And the underlying idea is that children are heard and their views are taken seriously. I'm just curious, how practical is this? And maybe I will direct this question to Professor Skelton and maybe Ambassador Molokomme. You could maybe then speak about these two UN policies and how they incorporate the voices of the child. How practical is this and how realistic is this? Are children, when you have special reports, do you include the voices of the children not on behalf being represented by an adult?
Yes, the committee, every time we're reviewing a state's party, prior to that we meet with civil society and we meet with children amongst civil society, and we actually usually spend a whole hour with children, whereas the poor NGOs have to fit all of their work, their presentations into a shorter time. So we give children more space and time. But of course, that makes it a very selective group of children that will be identified and brought, but they are identified by civil society through their organizations that work with and for children. And they're often representing the views of many other children whose work and ideas have come into. So we receive reports from children directly as well, and written reports as well as talking to them. But of course, when we're talking about situations of armed conflict, this becomes a very, very difficult thing to achieve. I mean, I think that when we reviewed Russia and we reviewed Ukraine, we certainly we knew a lot about the impact on children, and some of that work had been gathering information from children. But I think it would have been a stretch to expect children who had just been living in a war zone to come to Geneva to talk. I don't think it would be very realistic. When we do general comments, we have far more intensive consultations with children, and then we actually often include direct quotations from children in our concluding observations as well, so we don't filter it, we just put it there. So in brief, that's an answer, but I do think that this is more challenging in an armed conflict situation, but I do think it's very powerful to hear, just what Oleksandra read out to us there, the wisdom of that child of understanding when you go away, when you're fleeing a war, it's going to be a long time. So, yes, very powerful.
Skelton. Ambassador Molokomme, I mean, Professor Skelton has just mentioned the difficulties in the context of an armed conflict. If you think about access to the specific area where there is active armed conflict, or even in sometimes IDPs, refugee camps. In the African context, in June of 2022, the African Union adopted two policies, one on mainstreaming child protection in peace and security operations. And I was quite interested in two particular provisions where they put a lot of reference on child participation, children as victims of circumstance. And also this brings up to the principle of double jeopardy, where sometimes children can be victims but also prosecuted as perpetrators, and presumption of childhood. Could you perhaps maybe speak a little bit about what these policies are and why you think it was significant for the AU to adopt them?
Well, thanks for asking that and referring to those two policy documents. Because while they are not self-enforcing, I think regional frameworks and policy documents are an important starting point to begin to address some of these challenges. And I would agree with Professor Skelton there that the situation of armed conflict is a particularly challenging one to get children's voices involved. I mean, in Geneva, we have all the treaty bodies, as you know, get to meet in Geneva. And the first 2 years I was in Geneva, we were reviewed, the CRC, our CRC performance was reviewed. I must say, your process is rigorous. I mean, we had a huge team with officials from all the ministries in Botswana, and we usually behave, but I think on that during that particular review, we really felt under pressure because the voices of children were not really coming out. So we are learning as we go along as states, and we try to put peer pressure on each other to really pay some attention. Of course, we are also critical of the treaty bodies in the sense that there are so many reports to be made, and we get asked the same questions over and over again with respect to different treaties, so you end up having this reporting fatigue. So I think, and we have, of course, given the UN this feedback, but it's important. I think the voices of children need to come out. To the AU, where, as you say, I think those two instruments, the two policies were adopted in 2022, the policy on child protection in African Union peace support operations, and the second one being the policy on mainstreaming child protection in the African peace and security architecture. The press release that described these instruments said that they were a significant milestone, and I agree, in responding to the severe violations of children's rights in conflict situations in Africa, because they aim to mainstream child protection into AU institutional responses, which is very important, from peacemaking to peace building, and ensure child protection in AU-mandated, authorized, or endorsed peace support operations towards preventing violations against children in armed conflict and promoting accountability in mission areas. I think a very powerful objective in this regard. So there are two principles in there, what they call guiding principles in that policy, which I think they're fairly groundbreaking. Maybe they've been done somewhere else, but I think I just like the way that the AU, sort of hits the nail on the head. The first principle is children as victims first. The basis of which is that children in situations of conflict, by virtue of their age and evolving capacities, are by default victims of circumstance. So even where they've been used, as you said yourself, to commit offenses or are witnesses to offenses in the context of conflict, whether they are child soldiers or whatever they may be, the principle states that their vulnerability to instrumentalization, manipulation, and exploitation mitigates their culpability as perpetrators and should therefore not be used as a basis for punitive measures. This, I think, is important. Irrespective of the actual or perceived nature of their involvement, according to this principle, children should be accorded due process guarantees within a child-friendly justice framework and following international juvenile justice principles. They should not be prosecuted solely for their mere association to an armed group. I think, again, this is very powerful and concrete. The second guiding principle you'll also be aware of, Darleen, of course, is the presumption of childhood. This may be taken for granted by people from other parts of the world, but there are often disputes as to the age of a young person. And if means of age verification according to this principle are not available, childhood should be presumed. Of course, the effect of this is that of presuming majority, of presuming that this person is not a child, can have negative and irreversible consequences, a risk that would contravene the duty to uphold the best interest of the child, which is contained, of course, in the CRC and many other conventions at a global level. So the AU is very clear that this principle of presumption of childhood should guide the operations of PSOs, irrespective of contradicting local practices or prevailing social norms that attribute majority to persons below the age of 18, such as child marriage or traditional rites of passage. I think here the AU has really come in and been very clear about their role in protecting children and making sure that the rules do not militate, especially the domestic laws do not militate against protecting children. Again, we all know that birth registration is not yet universal in many African countries, so this is especially important here. So I think I'll stop there with these two instruments. There's much more to say, but I won't continue. We don't have the time.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Molokomme. Perhaps, Professor Mullally, if I may turn back to you, also staying in this theme of factoring in children's voices, I would like for you, maybe this is a twofold question. Last week, your office, together with the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict, released what I think personally is a seminal and very timely report looking at the linkages between child trafficking in armed conflict. Why do you think it was important for you to conduct this study and to have this linkage, which I think has never been done before? And secondly, in the report, there is an argument that the fragmented legal framework where the definition of a child varies from one instrument to another. Some provide 18 years, the anti-trafficking laws provide for 18 years of age, the Rome Statute for 15 years. Do you think this variance also has a bearing on the linkages as well, especially when it comes to recruitment and accountability? I'm sorry for the extensive question, but if you may.
Thank you very much. So the study on the linkages between trafficking and the 6 grave violations emerged over a period of time, initially through cooperation around the issue of abductions as a grave violation and the potential linkages with trafficking of children. So abduction involving a purpose of exploitation, which might be sexual exploitation, domestic servitude, forced labour, recruitment and use. And from that conversation and also related discussion around the treatment of children affected by armed conflict, who instead of being treated as victims as such are often punished through detention or prosecution or denials of consular assistance or failures of repatriation, and looking at how that non-punishment principle was also relevant. We discussed the importance of trying to understand better the linkages between patterns of trafficking of children in situations of armed conflict and the monitoring and reporting mechanism on the 6 grave violations, how sexual violence and rape may also be linked to trafficking of children in situations, for example, such as South Sudan or Tigray or Sudan or Democratic Republic of the Congo, how denial of humanitarian access may also be linked in terms of the impact of denial of humanitarian access on obligations of prevention, of assistance and protection, provision of services, how attacks on schools, or targeting of schools for recruitment purposes, as we heard about, that this is part of the pattern or strategy of armed groups in conflict situations to recruit children for a range of purposes of exploitation. So to understand those different purposes and also to recognise that human rights law, anti-trafficking laws continue to apply outside of the situation of armed conflict, so it can give an insight into better prevention, but also to what should happen in transition and post-conflict phases to ensure that the positive obligations of prevention, protection and accountability are met. And then it looks, of course, at the fragmented legal regimes that we have already heard about, and the different definition of a child, but that is with regard to recruitment and use in particular, with regard to other forms of trafficking in situations of armed conflict, that may not be so limiting, but of course it leads to some confusion on the ground. I think it's also very relevant to what the Ambassador just mentioned around presumption of childhood, age assessment, credibility assessments. Children, particularly adolescents, are often not believed to be children as such, or not treated as such, or treated as adults, and that has onward impacts in terms of their access to asylum and international protection, whether or not they are treated as child victims and given access to protection. And then, of course, there is the point that children may be trafficked as children, but then may be prosecuted as adults. And how do we understand the impact of trafficking over a longer period of time, as was mentioned also yesterday in the context of understanding trauma. And in the trafficking context also, there's some attention given, and more work needs to be done, particularly in the armed conflict situation, around access to justice, child-friendly justice procedures, ensuring that children are properly supported in investigation processes, ensuring that the procedures are in place, that children's voices are heard. And the treaty monitoring body in the Council of Europe under the Specialised Anti-Trafficking Convention has done quite a bit of work on that, drawing, of course, on the work of the CRC. And I think the African Committee on the Rights and Welfare of the Child within the African human rights system has also paid quite a bit of attention to children in armed conflict, the linkages with the 6 grave violations, and is one of the bodies that is looking at and has looked over a period of time at trafficking of children in armed conflict situations.
Thank you very much, Professor Mullally. Very interesting observations. We are about to come to the end of the panel, and I would like to welcome you to submit your questions. There is a QR code on the back of your brochure, and you can submit your questions right there. And then I will select some of them and read them out loud to the panelists. Oleksandra, maybe I can ask you one last question before we take public questions. Forcible transfer of children is a big deal in the Ukrainian context. I was also curious with your experience with collection of evidence, monitoring violations against children. How does integration or reintegration look like?
Okay, I'm just describing what exactly problem we have. So, first of all, we don't have numbers. We don't understand how many children we need to search at the territory of Russia Federation. Good news, we have a help, voluntarily help from Russia Federation, human rights defenders and volunteers who give us opportunity to trying to locate it where our children can be. We even have such project which call Kidmap, and this Kidmap, for example, figure out that we have Ukrainian children sent out to Kamchatka. For understanding, it's 8-time zone from Ukrainian Kamchatka, seriously, and hold the territory, huge territory of Russia Federation, hold the social caring system of Russia Federation involved in this process. That's why we so appreciated to the warring against this system of kidnapping and indoctrination children. We quite good in cyber war. We have First World War, cyber war, exactly. And Ukrainians, one of the best specialists in the world. So we figure out a lot of internal information, how exactly, what kind instruction around these children this system has. Indoctrination, its main topic, because they're afraid of Ukrainian children. So what that means, indoctrination? First of all, disconnect children with their understanding what that means, that I have identity of Ukrainians. We have Ukrainian state. I have my own citizenship. Okay, something happened here. I have my own citizenship, I have rights like Ukrainian citizen, and all of this. We have babies who exactly will never, if they stay at the Russia Federation, will never know about their Ukrainians, they have this connection, they have this identity. And that, like, we look at the experience of Argentina, where that was one of what happened with the children, and adoption happened, and what happened there. And they change names, they change data of birth. So they're trying to hide these children. And when we speak about numbers, Maria Lvova-Belova speak about last 10 years, we care about 700,000 children, with parents or without. So we understood that we need to find them, need to have some negotiation or some mediation by third country, maybe like Qatar now really active in that, to bring them back. But here we need to understand that partly we will not have it. So we need to prepare some program for adults person who after maybe 10, 15 years figure out that they are children from Ukraine. But when we bring them back, that's not just one moment. Okay, we have a parents or relative at Ukraine, we have some connections, we find the children in Russia. It's not happened like that. They are not exactly delivered children to Ukraine. They told, okay, your relatives come to Russia, and after this, you will spend there a few months. Sometimes they even try to have DNA tests. And we have one case when grandma going there to Russia Federation, and so this questioning by FSB, she's dying. And now we need to bring back from territory of Russia not only to her like grandchildren, but her body. So and that spend the money, that spend the time, and sometimes it's 1,000 of kilometers, and now we have less than exactly 1,000 children which we bring back. But what that means rehabilitation? Rehabilitation of these children, that's not only speak about, guys, all what you're hearing at the territory of Russia Federation, it's false. No, you need to speak with like few times traumatized child. That's why I'm exactly show these books, because it's examples, just two of NGOs which we supported. It's Voices of Children, which working from 2014, and it's Gen Ukraine. They trying to create psychological, systematic method of rehabilitation. And if Gen Ukraine working with the children who lose someone, and not only children who brings back from Russia Federation, children of Voices of Children, Voices of Children, they work with whole the system of trauma around of the war. And here we need to understand that we need a lot of resource for that. So we're trying to find it. And I think that's exactly, if you speak about international support and international answer, exists a country who feel uncomfortable to support Ukraine military in other way to in armor cost. Okay, exist this cost, because we need a resource exactly, bring back these children at the understanding they're safe, they can be in their rights, and they have a convention for children's rights, and after they will have all the rights of like adult citizen of Ukraine and person who protected by Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Thank you.
Very much. I would now like to open the floor for any questions in the room, and I will try and also share some questions that we have received online. Then I will start with some questions to all panelists. In your opinion, what are the most overlooked issues concerning children's rights in armed conflict by the international community, but also by research? Skelton, do you want to start us off?
Well, I think obviously some of the issues already outlined are new areas that we need to look at more. We've got to look more at jurisdictional questions. But let me take the opportunity, as we don't have much time left, just to go back to a theme that I mentioned earlier, and that is how the Committee on the Rights of the Child has been trying to stand on the shoulders of other bodies in trying to get our message across. So, for example, Alexandra's just mentioned Maria Lvova-Belova, and when the committee came, we asked, when the Russian Federation was before the committee, we asked them, are you cooperating with the prosecutor from the International Criminal Court regarding these allegations against Lvova-Belova? And in our concluding observations, we said the committee is deeply concerned about the alleged responsibility of the Presidential Commission for Children's Rights Director Maria Lvova-Belova, and then we asked in our concluding observations that Russia should cooperate with the United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine and with the International Criminal Court. And then I think with our review of Israel, this got stronger. We got more determined to do this. And there, for example, I asked the delegation, I see that the Secretary General has recently added Israel to the list of countries in the annexure who are committing the 6 grave violations, and what is your response to that? I didn't think that they would actually respond. They responded very strongly as to the fact that they found it shocking that they could be listed on the annexures, and they said they'd always previously cooperated. So in our feedback, we built on that, but also on the International Court of Justice. And I just want to read you a small excerpt from the opening introduction of our concluding observations. We say, we're going on about the fact that Israel repeatedly denies that the convention applies in times of war and in the occupied territories. We say, the committee is of the view that the state party's denial of the application of the convention cannot be used to justify its grave and persistent violations of international human rights and humanitarian law. In this regard, the committee recalls the jurisprudence of the International Court of Justice, including its advisory opinion of 19 July 2024, on the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and that international human rights instruments are applicable in respect of acts done by a state in the exercise of its jurisdiction outside its own territory, particularly in occupied territories. And then we go on to say, the committee, aligning its position with the position of the ICJ, reiterates that the convention applies to all children at all times and is directly applicable in all territories over which the state party exercises effective control, and reminds the state party of its legal obligations both under the convention and international humanitarian law. So you can hear from this how the committee then connects to these other bigger developments on the international stage. And we do it again in relation to the genocide case. We say later on, drawing attention to the advisory opinion of 19 July and the orders of the 26th of January and 24th of May of the ICJ on the application of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in the Gaza Strip, South Africa versus Israel, the committee urges the state party to, and then we set out a whole lot of recommendations that are there. And one of those is sign an action plan with the United Nations to end and prevent killing and maiming of children in attacks on schools and hospitals, and work with the Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Children in Armed Conflict to urgently put in place measures to better protect children. And we also mentioned the importance of the work of UNRWA in providing education and health services. So I think what you can see here is a kind of joining up of the dots, as it were, which I think is really quite new. And these concluding observations indicate how it's coming together. That, in other words, international law is beginning to coalesce somehow.
Very much, Professor Skelton. I would like to still open the floor and give priority to questions for people who are in the room. Otherwise, I'll continue taking the questions from online participants. Oleg, there is a lot of questions, so I'm actually afraid that we might not be able to answer all of them. But there is one specific question to Oleksandra, and this is a question from Frank Michaud, who is asking, was psychosocial support for traumatized deported children an issue on the Ukraine Recovery Conference 2024?
Exactly, it's a good question, because as for me, my opinion, we don't have. We don't have a system built for children, not only deported and children who was bring back, but for civilians at all, and for children especially. We have now a lot of we have initiative that's specific of Ukrainian society. We do that by own hands. First, always appear grassroots initiatives. So, like represented by me, these two organizations. But for now, from Ukraine like a state, because state little bit busy to fight, to defend us, We don't have still decision to cover hold the traumatized children or deported children by systematic, answers, how to support them, how to care about them, how to help them with rehabilitation. So that's big challenge. As for me, again, I'm not official representative of Ukrainian state. Maybe they will tell you NGOs always don't like what we are doing, but we don't see that. So we have answer, systematic answer, but we look in it. First Lady, Olena Zelenskaya, exactly providing a few really important campaigns about searching how it's need to be, about to support understanding that mental health, children or adult people, it's one of the basic of, healthy society at all after the war and during the war. So we have direction, but as for me, we still don't have a system.
Thank you, Oleksandra. Then the next question, I'm not sure who can answer this. I think it's also very specific to the committee, so maybe Professor Skelton, you can answer this as well. How can it be ensured that children in the Global South who are most affected by armed conflict participate meaningfully in the committee sessions held in Geneva?
Well, one of the problems that we face is that if children cannot get all the way to Geneva, and I'll leave Sierra Leone for others more qualified to answer, but then we should be able to use online services. However, the UN has also recently cut hybrid services to civil society organizations. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but this is a very big concern. I actually delivered my report to the General Assembly last night, and I flagged this as a huge impediment to our proper work with civil society, because so many civil society organizations will not be able to travel. And I know, Siobhán, you must be experiencing the same frustrations as we do. So if we do it, we actually have to do it like using Zoom or something like that, which is not too bad because children are more used to using Zoom, maybe. And we maybe do it during our lunch hour rather than during the formal session, because then it doesn't matter that we're not using the proper services of the UN. But we would definitely need civil society on the ground to be coordinating that, and they would be filtering what would be risky for children and what would be traumatizing. So as long as there is a good partnership and we are sure that the people who are working with the children on the ground, we're certainly open to hearing more, and we would happily try to, with support of UNICEF also, we could use their offices and their facilities.
Maybe just to add that, and I agree that, the space, the capacity of civil society organizations to participate, much as the treaty bodies are open to their participation, we also as governments need to be more responsive and to consult civil society more. I mean, I know that the Botswana government pays for some of the civil society expenses. Geneva is an expensive place. It's also the location of the hearings for these treaty bodies, which really militates against participation of civil society, let alone children. So I think it would be very important for governments to keep being reminded. We try as an Africa group in Geneva, as you know, the Africa group in Geneva, I think there are about 47 missions there, and we try, whether it's during these treaty body hearings or during the Human Rights Council, to also exert peer pressure on each other, to be more open to the participation of civil society, and not to feel that the treaty bodies are being intrusive. The mandate holders are being intrusive. Botswana, for example, we have an open door policy. We have an open invitation to mandate holders, and we share this with some of our colleagues and say, don't be too afraid and too hostile towards, some of the mandate holders, of course, then say stuff that is not very helpful, where they have not actually established and, ensured that their sources are reliable and so on. But it's all in the game, and I think that it will take a lot of that kind of approach, because children's issues are cross-cutting issues. And I'm so pleased that you have been joining these dots. I think more of the treaty bodies and special mandate holders need to join the dots at a high level in terms of international obligations, rather than, report on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and focus on the report itself, rather than on the interconnections between your obligations, what you are doing at home, and what you are doing also at regional and sub-regional level. So congratulations. I think that your committee is one of the exemplary ones in that regard. Thank you.
Seda Molokomme. There is a question specifically to Professor Mullally. Many children in northeast Nigeria are out of school due to attacks and abductions by members of the Boko Haram terrorist group. Do you consider this worrisome, and how does your mandate lead to accountability for these crimes?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. And this situation is a very serious concern. The trafficking mandate has undertaken a country visit to Nigeria. It was one of the countries in which was a priority to visit and report on, but also I've been involved in a number of communications specifically with regard to this situation, and also joining with the Special Rapporteur on sale and sexual exploitation of children, so bringing that together to highlight that situation. So that's an example where closure of schools or attacks on schools creates a context within which trafficking of children occurs for a range of purposes of exploitation, and continues with, limited accountability, but also limited effectiveness in terms of prevention, assistance and protection. In terms of what the special procedures mandates can do to ensure accountability, our communications can be taken up and used in other forums. For example, in court proceedings, we do also, from time to time, request permission to intervene in court proceedings or provide expert evidence, or our communications and statements may help to clarify the normative framework or bring forward a particular factual situation and provide credible evidence on that. But of course, it's all just trying to contribute to that process. And I think what the point around joining up with others is really important. The mandate on trafficking in persons has joined with the CRC and Committee on Enforced Disappearances and others, for example, to elaborate on the issue of illegal adoptions, both in situations of armed conflict and outside of that. We've also joined with the Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances and Committee on Enforced Disappearances to look at the trafficking context and how that links to enforced disappearances. But again, I think it's making those connections across the different mandates which is really critical and can help to try to develop the normative framework with hopefully more impact on the ground.
Thank you very much, Professor Mullally. Perhaps maybe one last question. Does the non-binding nature of general comments and special procedure add to the lack of effective accountability for children crimes in armed conflict? Professor Skelton, do you want to take this?
Sorry, could you read it again?
Does the non-binding nature of general comments and special procedure add to the lack of effectiveness of accountability for children's rights in armed conflict?
Well, the problem with the treaty body system is that it doesn't really have an accountability mechanism anyway. Even if we're talking about the binding provisions, what do we do? It's a good faith system. You rely on states responding to the recommendations. But that's why I think it's so important for us to look at this more holistically and not think that the treaty bodies or special rapporteurs can hold states accountable in a direct way. But of course we can do so in a more generic way, in calling them out, in using the public platforms that we have, in using the performative opportunity of the dialogue, in using strong statements. Of course, states don't always like this. Last night when I was reporting to the General Assembly online from my hotel room here in Nuremberg, the Russian Federation said that the Committee on the Rights of the Child spends far too much time writing general comments, and we wouldn't have such a backlog if we just concentrated on state party reviews. And I assured the honourable delegate that actually we do most of our general comment writing intersessionally, and therefore he need not be so concerned.
Thank you very much, Professor Skelton. Maybe one last question. How can we better hold states that engage in children's rights violation to account while avoiding selectivity and giving in to political pressure? Ambassador Molokomme, maybe Oleksandra.
I was hoping you wouldn't ask me. Yeah, how do we hold states accountable? Look, I think that goes really to the importance of the multilateral project. We need, as states, as members of the United Nations, wherever we find ourselves, to really work on a culture of delivering on what we say we believe in. It's a big project, but we need to continue working on it. As I say, at the level of the Africa Group, we try as much as we can. You know, the Human Rights Council, the peer review mechanism, to your point, that even though instruments are not binding, there is that sort of moral obligation. I think that more advocacy for children's rights, for human rights in general, building that culture of stronger institutions, a stronger civil society, more transparency, emphasis on consultation. It's difficult for governments, as you can imagine. I mean, with the political landscape being what it is in many of our countries. But I think that those governments which invest in consultation, in transparency, and so on, have seen the rewards, have reaped the rewards of stability. And I do hope that going forward, we can, as states, see that there are rewards out there for good behavior and compliance with international law, especially relating to children. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Molokomme. Oleksandra, last words?
Okay, I will try to 25 seconds. I see from two sides. From state side, for Ukraine, for example, Ukraine, as for me, need to be more active exactly at the whole system care about human rights internationally, because as for me, last 30 years before full-scale invasion, we will not be really involved to the reaction, for example, situation in other countries with the children wounded by conflict. So from us, like home task, we take this. If we will speak about all the principles, children need to be participate in this. We can imagine a world where the children and politics in different corner, but it's not at the reality. Ukrainian children live at the politics because you speak with relatives why we are here or there, why somebody shoot us, why it's happened. You need to give the answer. You need to educate children how live with result, consequences, all of the conflicts, because that's what they will have in future. They need to be prepared for that. They need to have enough knowledges, enough skills, enough understanding, and mental health. So we have a work, and each of us exactly can take a part in that. It's not something which only I don't know, authority need to do that. No, it can do any person. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this brings, because of time constraints, I'm very, very sorry. We cannot take any additional questions at this point, but I think you'll agree that this was a very fascinating, very insightful panel. Discouragements, but we still fight for a better tomorrow for all children in the world. Thank you so much.